My name is Ethan Brooks, and I was 22 when my life tilted quietly off its familiar axis. I didn't know it at the time, of course. I only knew that something inside me felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. I had friends, routines, and a future that looked acceptable from the outside, but there was a hollow space where certainty should have lived. I mistook that emptiness for freedom. I met Daniel Moore on an ordinary evening, the kind that usually dissolves into memory without resistance. The air was warm, the street half lit, and I was lingering longer than necessary at a small cafe near my apartment. Daniel stood out not because he tried to, but because he didn't. He carried himself with a calm that felt practiced, as if life had tested him and found him capable. When he spoke to the barista, his voice was steady, confident without being loud. I noticed myself listening. Our first conversation was brief and unremarkable on the surface. He asked if the seat across from me was taken. I said no. We exchanged names. He smiled in a way that suggested patience rather than charm. There was no spark I could point to, no dramatic moment I could replay later and say, that's when it began. What lingered instead was a sense of ease, the rare comfort of being spoken to without performance. Daniel was 35. He didn't announce his age. It surfaced naturally, folded into a story about work and time passing faster than expected. I told him I was 22, half expecting a shift in his tone. It never came. He listened to me with the same attentiveness, as if my thoughts deserved room to breathe. That alone felt intoxicating. We began to talk more often after that night. Sometimes we met by accident, sometimes by intention disguised as coincidence. Daniel asked thoughtful questions and remembered the answers. He spoke about his job with careful distance, about responsibility and routine, about how days could blur together if you let them. I spoke about restlessness, about wanting more without knowing what more meant. He never judged me for it. That made me want his approval in ways I didn't fully understand. It was during one of those conversations that Daniel mentioned his wife, Laura, almost in passing. He didn't linger on her name, didn't offer details. He stated the fact plainly, as if it were a fixed point that required no explanation. I nodded, telling myself it changed nothing. I told myself people could talk, could connect, without crossing any lines. The thought felt reasonable enough to silence my unease. Still, something shifted after that. I became more aware of what I didn't say, of what he didn't say either. There was a carefulness in our conversations, a subtle restraint that made every pause feel heavier. I noticed how he looked at me when I spoke about feeling unseen, how his expression softened as if he recognized something familiar. I noticed how I waited for his messages longer than I should have. Daniel never touched me. He didn't need to. The intimacy grew in the spaces between words, in shared silences that felt deliberate rather than awkward. I began to sense that I wasn't just enjoying his company, I was leaning on it. He offered a version of attention that felt rare, almost exclusive, and I absorbed it without asking what it cost. At night, I replayed our conversations in my head, searching for meaning where none had been explicitly offered. I wondered what his life looked like when I wasn't part of it. I wondered why he chose to spend his time with me. Those questions should have slowed me down. Instead, they pulled me closer. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself I was young, curious, allowed to feel what I felt without acting on it. But honesty has a way of eroding excuses. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. I liked who I was when Daniel listened to me. I liked the version of myself that existed in his presence, the one that felt interesting and understood. By the time I admitted that to myself, the ground beneath us had already shifted. Nothing improper had happened, nothing I could point to as a mistake. Yet I sensed, with a quiet certainty, that I was standing at the edge of something complicated. And instead of stepping back, I stayed exactly where I was, waiting to see what would happen next. What followed wasn't sudden. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Daniel Moore became part of my days in a way that felt natural enough to escape scrutiny. We talked in fragments at first, short messages, brief exchanges that filled the gaps between obligations. Over time, those fragments stitched themselves into something steadier, something I began to rely on. Daniel preferred evenings. He said they were calmer, less demanding. I understood what he meant without asking for details. Our conversations grew longer after sunset, stretching past reasonable hours. He spoke about work with a tired humor, about responsibility weighing heavier as the years passed. I listened carefully, eager to prove that I could understand a life so different from my own. When he asked about my day, I answered honestly, sensing that he wanted more than polite replies. There was comfort in the predictability of it. I began to anticipate his messages, structuring my time around the possibility of hearing from him. When my phone stayed silent, I felt the absence sharply, as if something essential had been withheld. I told myself it was harmless, that connection didn't have to mean anything more. Still, I noticed how easily my mood bent around his attention. Daniel never spoke badly about Laura, but he spoke around her. He described a home that functioned smoothly, efficiently, without warmth. His words carried no anger, only resignation. I told myself he was confiding in me because he trusted me, because I was safe. The thought made me feel chosen in a way I hadn't experienced before. I began to share more of myself in return. I told him about the confusion that followed me everywhere, about wanting to belong somewhere without knowing where that was. He listened without interruption, offering understanding instead of advice. When he said he remembered feeling the same way once, it created a fragile bridge between our lives. I crossed it without hesitation. There were moments when reality intruded. Daniel would cancel plans at the last minute or go quiet for hours without explanation. When he returned, he apologized briefly and changed the subject. I accepted those apologies too easily, grateful simply to have his attention restored. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. The secrecy settled in gradually. I stopped mentioning Daniel's name to my friends. I found myself editing stories, leaving him out as if he were a detail too insignificant to include. That should have unsettled me. Instead, it felt like protecting something delicate. I told myself not everything needed to be shared. Daniel's presence filled a space I hadn't realized was empty. When he praised my thoughts or laughed at something I said, it felt like validation rather than flattery. I began to measure my worth through his reactions, waiting for his approval before trusting my own feelings. The imbalance was subtle but persistent, growing stronger each time I ignored it. There were lines we didn't name but understood. He never invited me into his world, and I never asked to be part of it. Our connection existed in a narrow corridor carved out of time, untouched by the rest of his life. I told myself that made it simpler. I told myself complexity belonged to other people's mistakes. One night, Daniel admitted he looked forward to talking to me more than he should. He didn't phrase it as a confession, just an observation delivered calmly. My response came too quickly. I said I felt the same. The words settled between us, heavy with meaning neither of us chose to unpack. After that, the restraint thinned. Not in action, but in intention. I sensed that whatever we were doing had crossed an invisible boundary, one that couldn't be uncrossed by pretending it didn't exist. I felt a quiet thrill at that realization, followed closely by guilt I didn't know how to place. I told myself this was still innocent, still manageable. Yet somewhere beneath that reassurance lived a harder truth. I had become more than a listener in Daniel's life. I was no longer just passing time with him. I was replacing something he no longer wanted to face. And once I understood that, I knew there was no easy way back to where we started. Being close to Daniel more changed the rhythm of my days, but it also taught me how waiting could feel like a form of punishment. I waited for replies, for plans that might happen, for moments he could spare without explanation. The waiting became familiar, almost expected, and I learned to pretend it didn't bother me. Daniel's life remained carefully partitioned. There were times when he was fully present, thoughtful, attentive, generous with his words. In those moments, I felt grounded, convinced that what we shared mattered deeply. Then there were stretches of silence that arrived without warning. Hours passed. Sometimes entire evenings disappeared. When he returned, he spoke as if no distance had occurred, as if continuity was something we could assume rather than earn. I told myself this was the cost of knowing him. I told myself maturity meant understanding limits. Still, each absence chipped away at the confidence I had borrowed from his attention. I began to rehearse conversations in my head, imagining how I might ask for more without sounding unreasonable. I never followed through. I was afraid that asking would expose how little I was actually owed. Daniel spoke less about himself as time went on, or perhaps I simply noticed the gaps more clearly. He avoided details that placed him too firmly in his other life. When he mentioned Laura, it was only indirectly, as if her name might disrupt the fragile balance we had built. I started to imagine her in quiet moments, not as a rival but as a reminder of everything I wasn't allowed to claim. The imbalance between us became harder to ignore. Daniel had a home, a history, obligations that demanded his loyalty. I had flexibility, time, and a willingness to rearrange myself around his availability. I waited because I could. He disappeared because he had to. Naming that difference made it feel heavier, almost shameful. There were nights when our conversations felt strained, as if we were both aware of the tension but unwilling to acknowledge it. I sensed Daniel pulling back, measuring his words more carefully. When I asked if something was wrong, he assured me everything was fine. I accepted the answer even though it didn't settle anything. I started to question my own role. I wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense, there were no whispered calls or elaborate lies. But I existed outside the visible edges of his life, confined to private moments that could be erased without consequence. That realization stung more than I expected. I had thought intimacy guaranteed significance. I was learning it didn't. Daniel relied on me in subtle ways. He sought my opinion, my reassurance, my understanding. When he sounded exhausted or uncertain, I offered comfort instinctively. Yet when I needed the same, he was often unavailable. The exchange felt uneven, though neither of us acknowledged it. I wondered if he noticed how carefully I adjusted myself to fit into the space he allowed. Despite everything, I couldn't deny how deeply I cared. My feelings had grown quietly, without permission, until they demanded to be recognized. I tried to temper them with logic, reminding myself that this situation had boundaries for a reason. Caring, however, refused to be reasonable. One evening, after a particularly long silence, Daniel admitted he felt torn. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The weight of that admission settled heavily between us. I realized then that my presence offered him relief without requiring change. I was a pause in his life, not a direction. That understanding should have pushed me away. Instead, it left me suspended, unsure how to move forward without losing what little I had. I stood at the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to face. Staying meant accepting less than I deserved, and leaving meant confronting how much I had already given. The end didn't arrive with an argument or a revelation. It came quietly, the way truth often does when it can no longer be avoided. I sensed it in the way Daniel more hesitated before replying, in the careful neutrality of his words. What once felt like closeness now carried a distance neither of us could disguise. We met one last time without naming it as such. Daniel looked tired, not in the physical sense, but with the weariness of someone balancing too many versions of himself. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with an unfamiliar caution. I listened, already understanding more than he was willing to say. He admitted that his life was not going to change. There was no apology in his voice, only honesty stripped of comfort. Laura remained a fixed presence, an anchor he neither defended nor questioned. Daniel said he cared about me, and I believed him. What he didn't say mattered just as much. Caring was not enough to justify disruption. For a moment, I felt the old impulse to minimize myself, to accept what was offered and call it gratitude. That instinct had guided me for months, teaching me how to wait, how to settle. This time, it didn't hold. I realized how much effort it had taken to become smaller for him, how much of my certainty I had surrendered without being asked. I told Daniel how the waiting had changed me. I spoke about the silence, the uncertainty, the way I had measured my worth through his availability. He listened, truly listened, and that almost made it harder. When he said he never meant to hurt me, I understood that intention didn't erase impact. There was no dramatic goodbye. We sat with the truth between us, heavy but clarifying. Daniel didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't ask him to choose. We both knew the answers to questions we no longer needed to ask. When we parted, it was with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been shared and what could not continue. Afterward, the absence felt sharper than I expected. My days stretched open, unstructured by anticipation. I noticed how often I reached for my phone, how reflexively I thought of him in moments that had once belonged to us. Letting go was not an instant release. It was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming myself. With time, perspective softened the edges of my regret. I didn't condemn myself for what I had felt or for how deeply I had cared. Those emotions had been real, even if the situation was flawed. Loving someone who couldn't meet me fully taught me more about my own boundaries than comfort ever could. I began to understand that infidelity is not always loud or reckless. Sometimes it is quiet, sustained by emotional reliance and unspoken permission. I had crossed a line without realizing how far it extended, and stepping back required more courage than stepping in ever had. Daniel became a memory shaped by complexity rather than bitterness. I wished him well without wishing myself back into his life. The experience stayed with me, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of what happens when connection lacks clarity. Looking back, I don't regret meeting him. I regret only how long it took me to believe that I deserved to be seen without conditions. Walking away didn't feel like loss in the end. It felt like alignment. And even now, when I think of that time, I recognize it as a turning point. Not because it broke me, but because it taught me how not to disappear for someone else again.